point of information, Mr. Chairman, it's me.
Our next, I'll now recognize the gentlelady from Arizona, Ms. Lesko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to tell the testifiers and the people that came today, I sincerely appreciate all of you coming here, especially those of you that are victims of domestic or sexual violence or gun violence, and those that have lost people. I mean, I believe that all of us, whether we're Republican or Democrat, I hope you realize that we all care. We want to reduce gun violence. Sometimes there's just a difference in opinion of how we get there. And Mr. Chairman, I also want to join with our ranking member, Representative Collins, in saying how disappointed I am that you didn't allow Congressman Scalise to come testify today. And quite frankly, you know, he was wounded and is still recovering, and that's different than the other members that you said wanted to come testify and you didn't have time for. And so I'm still wondering why what happened. And also, Mr. Chairman, I just want to explain to you something that earlier when the gentleman, who I feel very sorry for, he lost someone from gun violence, he repeatedly got up and disrupted. It intimidated me. And it intimidated, I was told, one of the witnesses here. And so that's why I think it's important that we don't let that continue to happen. You know, I grew up in a family, I didn't have guns. My father was in World War II, and after he was in World War II, he quit hunting. And we didn't have any guns. And so I didn't know much about them. I had an irrational fear of guns. So I've been there. I've been there with some of you that have never shot a gun, have never experienced it. But then I started educating myself and realized that when you make all these laws, a lot of them are unenforceable, but also it's the criminals that don't follow the laws, right? Law-abiding citizens follow the laws. So if you're trying to stop gun violence, and most of the gun violence is caused by people that don't follow the laws, you're not really getting the solution that you want. And I am a strong supporter of the Second Amendment. And I'm also a survivor of domestic violence. And so I appreciated the testimony on that and want to share with you that there's people like me out there that have been victims, but we also want to be able to defend ourselves. And so I hope that you go away with realizing that we all want to solve this problem. I have to share with you that the Department of Justice, in a recent January 2019 report of prison inmates, they were interviewed, and the ones that used guns in their crime, 56% of them stated they obtained their gun by stealing it or by underground. And another 25%, so almost all of them, legally obtained it from a family member. So I guess what I'm trying to say to you is that when you have well-intentioned laws, and I believe you really believe that the background checks are really going to save people's lives, but you'll see that most of the people that committed the crimes actually stole the guns. Stole the guns, got them from family members, so universal background checks will not help in most of those situations. I also studied all the major mass shootings quite intensely and realized that not one single one of them would have been prevented from a universal background check. I mean, I went through all the details, I asked all the questions. You know, and I do think there are many ways that we can reduce gun violence, and we've done it here in a bipartisan fashion. Last year, or in fiscal year 18, we passed legislation that helps prevent violence in our schools. Very important. We also wanted to protect and fix the National Instant Criminal Background Check, which is the system where these backgrounds are actually, you know, you find out. And we found out through studies that a lot of the states and agencies don't even report the information. And
Time of the gentlelady has expired. Do you have a quick question?
Oh, yes, I do. Thank you very much, Mr. Nadler. I just want to say to Ms. Lindquist, thank you for being here. Can you please explain again how these well-intentioned laws actually hurt you from not allowing you to defend yourself?
The witness will answer the question.
So I do want to say, you know, thank you for speaking publicly about being a survivor of domestic violence. It's terrible that anyone has to go through that, but you can feel very alone, and so it's great to see people in positions of power talking about it. So the laws that specifically disarmed me are in the state of Pennsylvania, where I was going to school. My college was a gun-free zone, so you couldn't have firearms of any kind unless, of course, you were the police. And then also, like I said, live in Virginia and originally went to undergrad in Pennsylvania, which would require driving through Maryland, which would make me like immediately a felon. So it's a combination of those two things.
The time of the gentlelady has expired. The gentleman from Rhode Island, Mrs. Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for being here and for many people who are in the audience. Your testimony is incredibly inspiring and invaluable, and I cannot overstate the importance and urgency of this hearing. And I want to thank the chairman for his leadership. This is the first hearing in the U.S. House of Representatives on gun violence prevention in nearly a decade. We have a gun violence epidemic in this country. In some disproportionately impacted communities, persistent incidents of gun violence have become a fact of life and are endangering the public health of these communities. Over the last 8 years, while Congress was ignoring this problem, the gun death rate has risen by 17%, the gun suicide rate by 19%, and the gun homicide rate by 14%. The gun rate hit a nearly 20-year high in 2017 at roughly 40,000 deaths, according to the CDC. The U.S. is now the world leader in child gun deaths, with death by gunshot being the second highest cause of death among children ages 1 to 19. On average, the number of Americans murdered by a firearm has risen to approximately 100 every day, while another nearly 300 are shot. Mr. Chairman, I just noticed that the time was not reset. So Mr. Chairman, I don't think the time was ever corrected from the last person speaking over.
There appears to be a mechanical problem.
I'll just keep going and trust you to be fair. Each of these statistics is another example of this body's shameful failure to protect Americans from gun violence, and behind each number is a real family devastated by this epidemic. Despite our many efforts over the last years imploring Republicans to enact common sense gun safety legislation, all we could ever muster was 30 seconds of doing nothing and saying nothing in a moment of silence. There was no hearing in response to many of the deadliest mass shootings our country has ever seen. Think about what that means. Congress did nothing when children were massacred at Sandy Hook Elementary School, at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, and Santa Fe High School. When worshipers were gunned down in Charleston, Oak Creek, Sutherland Springs, and Pittsburgh. When people were hunted down and killed at a nightclub in Orlando, at a movie theater in Aurora, and a country music concert in Las Vegas. In some of these cases, the gunman would have failed a background check but got a gun anyway. In others, the gunman lawfully possessed deadly military-style assault weapons or high-capacity magazines, endangering our communities and belong in the battlefields, not in our neighborhoods. In all of them, Congress could have taken action to try and prevent these tragedies from happening again. It is imperative that we do all that we can to keep guns out of the hands of people who should not have them and give law enforcement the tools they need to protect the public. And that's why I've introduced several bills to prevent children, violent persons, and criminals from accessing guns. A bill to ban assault weapons and dangerous bump stock devices. legislation requiring states to establish reporting systems for mental health professionals when individuals that have committed or communicated a serious threat of violence, government funding for the CDC to research firearm violence as a public health issue. The American people are completely fed up with this institution's willful neglect and leaving them to suffer in the face of a clear epidemic. They're demanding that we finally do something before another horrible tragedy happens and before another dangerous weapon ends up in the wrong hands. It's long overdue for Congress to prevent further senseless violence from occurring. We know what the solutions are. It's time to act. And the notion that since there is not a single bill that, if passed, will eliminate all gun violence, that we should do nothing is an absurd justification for inaction. The truth is there are a whole set of bills that, if we pass, will substantially reduce gun violence in this country. And this bill, H.R. 8, is the first step. And I want to thank Mr. Thompson, the chair of the task force, Robin Kelly, Catherine Clark, many of my colleagues who have been great champions of these issues. We have a responsibility to make sure that we keep guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them. We know background checks work. 3.5 million people have been blocked as prohibited purchasers from buying a gun because of background checks, and yet 22% of gun sales happen without a background check. So imagine how many gun sales happen that prohibited purchasers get because of this loophole, because there's no background check. So H.R. 8 is the beginning, but I want to begin my question to Aliala Eastman and first say, we owe you an apology. We owe your whole generation an apology. The adults have failed you. And I'm here to tell you, I was a founding member of Mayors Against Illegal Guns when I was mayor of the city of Providence. I've continued to fight on this issue. We are going to deliver results, and it's because of the voices of young people who have demanded that we do our job and pass common sense laws that will protect you. And so I want to say thank you to you and to all the young people who are here. I want to say thank you to the chief. I'd like to ask the chief and the doctor to talk a little bit about what your observations are about high-capacity magazines, assault weapons, and the injuries that are sustained.
The time of the gentleman has expired. We'll permit one witness to answer the question. Mr. Cicilline, which witness?
Oh, my, the doctor or the police chief? I guess the doctor. My mother always wanted me to be a doctor.
All right, great. Well, thank you for that question, Congressman. It's a really important one because, you know, we as healthcare professionals are on the front line of seeing this day in and day out. And when you see these patients come in, you know, we're seeing the full spectrum of where there's tissue that's pulverized, where there are flesh wounds, where people are bleeding to death in front of our eyes. And, you know, medical technology is great, but the solution is really prevention. And so I think, you know, we owe it to Americans to really think beyond the operating room, to think beyond the hospitals, to really implement some common sense change.
Thank you. The time of the gentleman has expired. Mr. Reschenthaler.
Mr. Chairman, I just have a unanimous consent request.
The gentleman will state his unanimous consent request.
I'd ask unanimous consent to introduce into the record a Washington Post article entitled, "It's Time to Bring Back the Assault Weapons Ban, Gun Violence Experts Say." Another article entitled, "Why Can't the U.S. Treat Gun Violence as a Public Health Problem?" Another article from the New York Times, "Wounds from Military-Style Rifles, a Ghastly Thing to See." A Vox article, "America's Unique Gun Violence Problem Explained in 17 Maps and Charts." And finally, orders to seize guns from prohibited buyers at a 10-year high.
Without objection, these documents will be admitted into the record. Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a lifelong resident of southwestern Pennsylvania and a gun owner myself, I know that despite what some of the people in this room may want you to believe, the overwhelming majority of American gun owners are hardworking, law-abiding citizens. These law-abiding citizens are simply looking to protect their families, hunt with their kids, or just put food on the table. That's why I'm strongly opposed to H.R. 8 and other legislation that does nothing to address the root causes of gun violence, like mental health, and instead focus on limiting law-abiding citizens' ability to exercise their Second Amendment rights. More gun bans are not going to solve this problem. The tragic shootings in both San Bernardino and Newtown occurred in states that already had an assault weapons ban in place. I was in high school when Columbine occurred. The Columbine High School shooting took place during the federal assault weapons ban. More gun bans are not going to solve this problem. Instead, I would urge my colleagues across the aisle to focus on enforcing the laws we already have on the books that keep guns out of the hands of criminals, gang members, and others who wish to do us harm. The Trump administration has already made this a top priority. In the first 9 months of 2017, federal prosecutions for possession of an illegal firearm increased by 15%, and the number of people charged with using a firearm in a crime also improved. Now compare that with the Obama administration, which in 2010 prosecuted only 44 of nearly 50,000 fugitives and felons who attempted to illegally purchase firearms. Think about that, only 44 out of 50,000. At the end of the day, the Constitution declares that gun ownership is not a privilege that is just for a select reserved few, but a protected and fundamental freedom guaranteed for all law-abiding citizens. With that in mind, I'm very concerned about H.R. 8, which Democrats tout as a universal background checks bill, but it's actually the first step toward creating a national gun registry. I know my friends from across the aisle will point to the fact that language in the bill explicitly prohibits the creation of a national gun registry. However, the U.S. Department of Justice has said that universal background checks would only be enforceable if there is a mandatory national registration of firearms. So with that said, Professor Malcolm, do you think the American people should be concerned that H.R. 8 would ultimately lead to a national gun registry?
I think they do and should be concerned. Great Britain had a national registry for firearms, and at one point in 1999, they banned the personal possession of handguns, and because there was a registry, they were able to get all of the handguns that people owned, the law-abiding people who had actually registered them. Within 10 years, the crimes with handguns had actually doubled. So it really did not take the guns away from the people who were going to misuse it. All it did was it disarmed the law-abiding people.
So Professor Malcolm, in your opinion, is H.R. 8 an effective way to address gun violence?
I don't think so. This committee obviously wants to do something that's going to make a difference, and that law is not going to make a difference. It's just going to make it harder for people, criminalize people who had innocently let someone else use their gun or have to pay an extra fee in order to be able to get a gun legally transferred.
Thank you, Professor Malcolm. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from California, Mr. Swalwell.
Thank you to the chairman, and I want to thank the students and parents who are here today. My congressional orientation was going on when Sandy Hook happened, and as awful as that was, I thought it was an opportunity for us to finally do something about gun violence in America. And after 6 years, from Sandy Hook to Pulse to Charleston and all the cities we've come to learn, we saw moments of silence followed by moments of inaction. And then Parkland happened. And I don't know why Parkland changed the way that our country started to look at this. Maybe it's because the students at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas could articulate what the beautiful babies at Sandy Hook could not, just the sense of loss, but their belief that you should have the right to learn, the right to go home, and the right to live in your classrooms. And you've given us a renewed sense of hope. And even though last night at the State of the Union, you didn't hear one single word from the president about gun violence, despite all the people in the gallery who had lost loved ones, and even the people he had brought, where the common tool of their loss was a firearm. Not one word. That didn't bother me, though, because I knew we'd be here today. The first historic hearing in 8 years on reducing gun violence. So thank you for giving us hope. Thank you to Mike Thompson, my colleague, who has continued to believe that we can do better and that we can start with background checks. And I just want to first address an argument that my colleagues keep making, which is that this will not reduce every gun violence death in America. That is absolutely true. But if that is your standard, then we should just all go home and never strive to do anything to make us safer in our communities. But if we work together on background checks, on mental health illness, which I believe is correctly identified as another issue, if we work together to study gun violence through research, if we make sure that in our cities we're investing in gang prevention, if we reduce to take the most dangerous weapons like assault rifles out of the hands of the most dangerous people, we can seriously reduce in our lifetime the number of families who would have to sit in a gallery and experience that loss. So thank you for being here. Thank you for giving us this renewed sense of hope. I want to also thank our law enforcement officers for what you do every day. My brothers are cops, my dad was a cop, and my fear is every day as they're out on the beat that they're outgunned. And I know that's why you're here, is to protect the men and women sworn in your department. Dr. Saccharin, you were at the State of the Union last night, and I was hoping you could talk about an issue that I'm very passionate about, which is having a ban on assault weapons. And I learned as a prosecutor that when a round flies out of an assault weapon, oftentimes, because of the pistol grip, because you can indiscriminately spray a crowd and you don't have to be an expert shot, you're firing a much more powerful round than many of the other weapons that are out there. And you've seen on your trauma room table the differences from what damage this does to the body. Could you just describe, why an assault weapon, if someone is hit with it, is different, and just, why we should treat those differently than perhaps other weapons?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Congressman, and thanks for your leadership. When someone is hit with a bullet from an assault weapon, in addition to causing damage to the structures that are actually being hit, there's also a blast effect that occurs. And so there's damage to the surrounding tissue. So that damage is a lot more significant than you would see with, say a handgun, for example. And, we do everything we can to try to control hemorrhage, fix the damage, and, save lives. But that's not always possible.
Thank you, doctor. And I'll never forget, a trauma surgeon and a pathologist telling me when a victim that I had worked on his case, he was shot in the back of the thigh. 40 rounds fired at him, just hit once in the back of the thigh, and he passed away. And the pathologist and ballistics expert said it was because of just the sheer energy from the round. Also, I want to ask Ms. Thomas, thank you as well, Ms. Thomas, for testifying. Australia enacted a comprehensive buyback on assault weapons. It was about 650,000 assault weapons. Are you familiar with the effects after that buyback in their country when 35 people were killed and 28 were wounded in 1996?
Yeah, in the Port Arthur massacre, following that legislation being passed, there has not been a single mass shooting that has occurred in Australia since that time.
Thank you. I yield back.
For a moment before you yield back.
Yes.
Thank you. Dr. Saccharin, just yes or no, is the extra energy and the difference between being hit by an assault weapon, the assault rifle, and something else, is that because of the much greater velocity of the round from the assault rifle than from a normal gun?
The kinetic energy that is being transmitted to the body is much.
And that extra kinetic energy is because of the greater velocity?
Velocity does have to do with the kinetic energy, correct.
Thank you very much. Mr. Klein is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've been up here a month, and during the campaign, I've been in the legislature at the state level for 16 years, so I had a pretty good idea of what the role of the state legislature was. At the federal level, during the campaign, I carried around what I call the instruction manual, the Constitution, and I know that a lot of people like to talk about how, well, it's not that it wouldn't have affected any of these mass shootings, but it's that if we can take steps to prevent one more shooting or one more criminal from illegally purchasing a firearm, then it's worth essentially doing what this document tells us we should not do, which is infringe on the rights of the people to keep and bear arms. So it's important to remember that this is the instruction manual, and we need to keep it in mind as we talk about whether or not we're going to essentially violate it. So what I would ask, Professor, in your remarks, you mentioned that the Second Amendment, the framers bequeathed to us as individuals the right to keep and bear weapons in common use for self-defense and other lawful purposes. I would disagree with that in that the framers didn't bequeath to us that right. That is, God has given us that right. And we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And these rights are to be secured by government. And that's what this Constitution is for. And so, to my question, do you think that criminals who have committed crimes and ignored the law are going to suddenly miraculously follow new laws put in place that are going to prevent them from purchasing firearms without a background check?
No, clearly they're not going to be bothered by it. If they're not going to obey the laws against harming people and shooting people, they're not going to be worried about trying to get a gun through a legitimate source or following a background check. I mean, it's a shame because I think this committee could do really good work, but this particular law is not going to really help solve this problem.
Thank you. And to Ms. Thomas, I'm reading your testimony and would ask you a similar question. Do you believe that criminals who have ignored the laws, I mean, you talk about 96% of inmates who were prohibited from possessing a firearm at the time they committed the crime obtained a gun in violation of that prohibition. Do you believe that they are suddenly miraculously going to follow a law in order to violate another law?
I believe that we need to pass H.R. 8 because it will actually enable the existing federal law that's on the books to be properly enforced. We currently prohibit those individuals from acquiring firearms, and they can very easily go online, go to a gun show, go to a parking lot, and buy a gun from an unlicensed seller. That seller is not breaking any law when they transfer the gun without a background check. So we're not just talking about the buyer of the gun breaking the law. We're also creating a system where the sellers of firearms understand that part of that transfer must entail a background check as well. So we're basically taking the law that exists and we're making it actually applicable to all sales as it should be.
Do you believe that a registry is necessary as part of that system?
This law, H.R. 8, prohibits a registry.
But do you believe that a registry is necessary as part of that system?
I don't. I believe that H.R. 8 being passed is a very important first step to reducing gun violence in America, and it prohibits a registry from being created.
Do you believe that Heller was correctly decided?
I support the decisions of our Supreme Court.
So you think it was correctly decided?
I think that it overturned previous precedent, and we agree that there are some issues with the decision based upon its interpretation of the Second Amendment, but we support the decisions of our Supreme Court.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Jeffries.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank all of the witnesses for your presence here today. Let me begin with Professor Malcolm. The National Rifle Association opposes expanding background checks to cover firearm purchases at gun shows, true?
The right to life? I didn't get the first part of your...
The NRA.
Oh, the NRA.
You're familiar with
Yes.
that organization, correct?
Yes, I didn't. Yes.
Okay. They oppose background checks to cover the gun show loophole, true?
There's almost no gun show loophole.
Okay.
They're virtually, but they do not want a registry, and they do not want things made more cumbersome for people who would like to be able to get
Claiming my time, I didn't say anything about a registry. You oppose expanding the background check requirement for the gun show purchases, true?
We're not just talking about gun shows. We're talking about making people in private sales have to go through background checks and making the whole system much more cumbersome.
I'm asking you specifically about gun shows. Do you support expanding background checks to cover gun shows or not?
There's almost no need for that.
Okay, I take that as a no. Thank you. In terms of expanding background checks for gun sales on the internet, the NRA opposes expanding background checks to cover such sales, true?
I'm really not privy to all of their decisions on these things.
Okay, you oppose background checks as it relates to internet gun show sales, true?
Can I just say, I would like to see the background check that we now have used properly. And it is not, because too many people are not put on that background check who ought to be.
Okay, now you are the Patrick Henry Professor of Constitutional Law and the Second Amendment at George Mason University, is that right?
Yes.
And is it fair to say that this position is bought and paid for by the NRA?
I don't know.
Okay, this position was created in 2003, true?
I don't know what the background is, but I will say that George Mason University has been very conscious of being sure that any contributions to the law school for any particular positions don't have any strings attached. And you can check what, the procedures are for that.
Okay, now when the position was created, it was a direct result of a $1 million endowment from the National Rifle Association Foundation, correct?
I was not at George Mason University in 2002, so I really don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
You seem to have more information about it than I do.
Okay. The NRA Foundation has continued to give money to the law school, is that right?
I assume so, if that was an endowment.
Okay. I asked unanimous consent to enter.
You think that's funny? I really don't know.
No, I didn't laugh. I asked you, this is not a laughing matter. This is a gun violence epidemic that we have in America. Now, let me ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the 990 forms from the NRA Foundation for the years 2012, 13, 14, 15, and 16.
Without objection, the documents will be entered into the record.
So in 2012, the NRA Foundation gave $100,000 to the law school in connection with the position that you hold and for, quote, Second Amendment study, correct?
Well, I presume that they did, but they didn't have anything to do with my particular job.
Okay,
I don't get a penny more for having that.
Okay, you arrived in 2013, is that right?
Excuse me?
You arrived in 2013?
2006.
You arrived?
I didn't, but I didn't have the chair until later.
That's correct. In 2013, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, now in 2013, the NRA Foundation gave $100,000 to the George Mason University Law School for, quote, Second Amendment study, true?
Presumably they did.
In 2014, the NRA Foundation gave $100,000 to the George Mason University Law School for, quote, special grants, other studies related to the Second Amendment, true?
They have not subsidized anything that I have done. I was hired, I was given this chair because I had already done serious work on the legal and constitutional background of the Second Amendment.
Okay, what we found is that the NRA has given $1 million to endow the position that you now hold, hundreds of thousands of dollars over the last several years. And the problem is we can have a legitimate debate about how to deal with the gun violence epidemic, but it's hard to have that legitimate debate when the NRA functions as holding others who are supposedly participating in this debate like they are wholly owned subsidiaries. Not saying you are or you aren't, but we do know that in connection with the position you hold, it's funded by the National Rifle Association. I yield back.
Thank you. The time of the gentleman has expired.
Mr. Chairman,
there's a vote. There's a vote on the floor now. There are 2 votes on the floor. There are 6 minutes and 46 seconds remaining on the first vote. 363 people not having voted yet. The committee will stand in recess until immediately after the second vote in this series, which will probably be about 15 minutes. Members of the audience are advised there is no crowd outside, so you probably won't give up your seat if you walk out.
The House Judiciary Committee meeting today on the issue of gun violence and the underlying proposed legislation, H.R. 8 by Mike Thompson of California. The committee in a brief recess here. There's a series of votes on the House floor, and they will return as those votes wind down. We will continue with live coverage when the committee gavels back in. Until then, part of the earlier session of today's hearing.
My first question is for Dr. Sakrin. Dr. Sakrin, we have heard today, and we hear repeatedly during this extended debate, that the real problem, or one real problem, is mental health, that we ought to deal better with mental health. Now, I'm sure no one objects to dealing better with mental health problems. My question is the following. As I noted in my opening statement, gun deaths in most other countries are in this double or single digits, double or triple digits, to 300, 200, 100. In our country, it's 35 to 40,000 a year. Is there any evidence, number one, that mental health differences, that our people are 10,000 times more mentally ill on average than people in other industrialized countries, that this provides an explanation, and that dealing with mental health alone will go any distance towards solving this problem?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that question. You know, the disparity that exists between our country and other comparable countries is dramatic, as you suggest. And even when folks factor in for the rates of mental health disease and other issues, we still exceed all those other countries by a significant proportion. So it's not that we're completely dissimilar.
Thank you. I'll ask you one other question. Firearms emergency protective orders empower family and law enforcement who recognize signs of danger to petition for a court order to temporarily remove a person's access to guns if they're likely to use them to harm themselves or others. Briefly, please, what can Congress do to ensure that every American has access to an extreme risk protection order in appropriate circumstances when someone they love is experiencing such a crisis?
Yeah, I mean, this is such an important issue, because when you look at the majority of deaths from firearms, those come from suicide, 2/3. And the reality is when you look at the time that it takes from when the person decides to commit suicide till they actually make that first attempt, 50% happen within the first 10 minutes. And so being able to have...
So what can Congress do?
Yeah, so being able to have extreme risk protection orders where you can empower family members and you can empower law enforcement to temporarily actually seize weapons so that they're not a harm to themselves or others, I think is critical.
Thank you. Ms. Thomas, the NRA and others have argued that enacting universal background checks would penalize law-abiding gun owners and prevent such transfers as a father giving a gun to his son. Yet the plain language of H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act, is narrowly written and clearly allows for this kind of transfer. Can you walk us briefly through H.R. 8 and how it explicitly protects these kinds of common transfers?
So basically what H.R. 8 does is it takes our existing law, which prohibits this variety of individuals that we deem to be at highest risk from purchasing firearms. Now, these individuals can buy firearms easily without a background check through an unlicensed sale. This law would mean that all transfers of firearms have to take place through a gun dealer, including a background check, so that background check would apply to all individuals. There are exceptions in the law for a number of instances, including self-defense, including loans for hunting and other lawful purposes, and also for transfers within immediate family members, grandparents, parents, and
within immediate family wouldn't be subject to this?
Excuse me?
Would not be subject to this requirement, immediate family transfer?
Exactly. There's an exception for immediate family members being
transferred. Thank you. Again, Ms. Thomas, the only federal agency with jurisdiction to regulate the gun industry has had its hands tied for decades through a combination of restrictive policy riders and a shrinking budget. Can you talk about the challenges facing the ATF in its efforts to effectively regulate the gun industry and what Congress needs to do to ensure better regulatory oversight of this agency?
Well, I think there's two main issues that you're referring to. One is the funding question and the size of ATF. The entirety of ATF is the size of the Las Vegas Police Department, so it's a rather small group of people looking to to look after 55,000 gun dealers across the United States. Approximately 8% of those gun dealers were able to be even inspected last year based on the number of agents that ATF has. So better funding is an absolute necessity for federal law enforcement to be able to properly do their job. Secondarily, I think you're referring to the TART restrictions, which—
What restrictions?
The TART restrictions, which are an appropriations rider which prevent ATF from aggregating trace data and using that information to properly do their job to find the source of gun trafficking. They are also prevented from modernizing their records, which is helpful to also doing their job properly as law enforcement, as well as encouraging or forcing gun dealers to keep better track of their inventory so they can better understand the source of guns.
We should repeal those restrictions.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. And I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Collins, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That was an interesting line of questions because it hit on some things that I want to discuss. And Ms. Thomas, since you're up, we'll just continue here. On your website, it says that your organization supports national firearms registration that includes name, address, other identifying information about the owner of a firearm, names of the manufacturer, importer, model, type of action, caliber, gauge. You get the picture. You also like to require renewals of registrations annually, including submitting to a background check. Is this correct? It's off your website.
One of the many policy solutions that we think would go a long way to helping reduce gun violence would be registration.
Okay, so that's a yes. I'm just asking for yes or no
here. It is one of the many comprehensive laws that we think needs to be in place if we're going to make progress in reducing gun violence in America.
And your organization, as you've already stated, is a very active supporter of H.R. 8. But do you realize that H.R. 8 explicitly states that nothing in this act or any amendment made by this act shall be construed to authorize the establishment directly or indirectly of a national firearms registry? In fact, it goes out of its way to say it doesn't create a firearms registry. How do you square this position calling for a registry with a bill explicitly saying it doesn't?
That is absolutely what H.R. 8 says, and we firmly support everything included in H.R. 8. When we go to our website includes the most comprehensive source of analysis of every gun law in every state and at the federal level, both in existence and what is possible in a world where we might want to very comprehensively regulate guns, as they do in many other countries. So what's on our website refers to all of the possible policy options that this body and state governments can consider when they're looking at opportunities to regulate guns and reduce gun violence.
I think it's really interesting because it's been reported, even under the previous Department of Justice, the Obama administration, that there's no way to actually regulate private sales. Let's talk about what we're actually talking about here. This is private sales, okay? Not when you go to a federal licensed firearm dealer. This is private sales is what is wanted to be regulated. That needs a registry because you can't keep up with it without a registry. And this goes back to my opening statement when I said, I'm not sure which is crueler, to actually tell people who come to this hearing to say we're fixing your problem and then offer something that it doesn't fix. The question here, because it guts itself inside the bill. You also mentioned red flag laws, which I share a concern here. But the interesting thing is on the red flag, H.R. 8 itself actually prohibits, like if I was this morning to get up and I've had a bad night, let's say whatever, and I just said, I don't want to live anymore, and I'm going, H.R. 8 actually would criminalize if I went across the street to my neighbor and said, I'm having a bad day, I want to make sure I don't have anything to hurt myself or my family, and give those guns to my neighbor. It actually would criminalize that. It's not in the listed exceptions, and I know there's a lot of it, but if you read the bill, it's not there. So again, I think what we've got to do is look at what is honestly being discussed here. I'm going to switch to Chief Acevedo. Chief, it's good to see you again. We had a great time in Houston. Doing something now, and you brought that up, and I think it's an issue. You know my father's in law enforcement, and I think doing something now is a commendable thing if it actually works, if it actually fits. How can you explain what we just said, going off this last conversation, can you explain how H.R. 8 can operate effectively without a firearms registry? And do you see implementation problems in this?
Well, I think that the recommendations that H.R. 8 has in there, the legislation, will not solve, will not eliminate gun violence, but it'll certainly, I don't think anyone in this panel would say that it wouldn't prevent at least one death. And the question I would have is, passing, if that one death was your child, your mother, your father, is a little inconvenience too much to save that life? And if the answer is no, then there's nothing I can say that's going to change your mind on H.R. 8, but I believe that the legislation will save at least one life. And if it's my child who dies, I want him to know, and I want God to know, that I was here today speaking on that life.
And I think the interesting thing is how many, though, again, in a law that you passed, that you give people comfort in saying that would actually pass, can I simply say the transfer was made before this without a registry? And I think this is an interesting thing to actually explore here. We're going to explore this more when I'm sure it is marked up. I'm not questioning by any means the decision or the desire to find a solution to this. This is it. I was I'm still in the military. I was in Iraq. I had the trauma surgeons in Iraq. We talked about this extensively. You know, this is not an issue, but let's also look at this holistically, because every time we want to go to fix this, we go to the population that is the legal gun owners buying or selling in the legal format. We go to BOP, the Bureau of Prisons, when they put out their statistics. Most criminals do not get their, as you well know, do not get their guns from legal sources. They don't. The question is interesting, curious, because this has come up a little bit. My time is running out, but an interesting discussion here is what would be the penalty for robbing a federally licensed firearm or dealer? What should it be and how should it be enforced? Because that's becoming more and more of an issue.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The witness may answer the question.
I believe that this has to be a two-pronged approach. We need to take folks that would commit gun violence, steal firearms. We need to have a zero tolerance and a real tough approach on that. The other thing that we need to look at is to have these gun dealers actually have to lock their firearms every night. One of the #1 targets of gang members and other criminals is pawn shops and places and gun shops where they come in and burglarize those places. So I think there's a way to do it. And I think the other thing we need to do is to have Congress actually authorize and fund studying a comprehensive study on this matter once and for all, and let the experts come up with the policy decisions on an evidence-based, which is really interesting because you're from George Mason University, pardon me? And I'm actually in the evidence-based Hall of Fame there, so I really believe that we need to study it, we need to fund it, and lastly, we need to get ATF some help. They're a great partner, but they truly are, because of lack of funding and support of the Congress, operate with one hand behind their backs, or one arm behind their backs. We need to give them both arms.
Thank you. The time of the gentleman has expired. Ms. Lofgren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am so pleased that we're having this hearing today. You know, we've experienced an epidemic of gun violence in this country, deaths from mass shootings, suicides, and for years we have failed to have any attention, any hearings, any legislation to deal with this epidemic and this tragedy. So I am pleased that we now have the opportunity to begin work on this public health crisis. You know, it's our turn to set the agenda and to listen to the American people. So I appreciate all of the witnesses who are here, and especially the young people who are in the audience who have spoken up across the country with passion and eloquence, and it's your energy that has helped us be here today. I do have a question, Ms. Thomas, about a study that was done by Everytown for Gun Safety. They reviewed an online firearms marketplace, and according to their report, they found that almost 1 in 9 prospective gun buyers from this website would not have passed a background check. And they gave one example of a customer in Georgia who was looking to buy a handgun immediately, he said within 24 hours, and a public records request showed he had multiple felony convictions, including one for child molestation. He was currently under indictment. This was someone who shouldn't have a gun. He wouldn't have passed a background check, and yet he was able to obtain it through this unlicensed seller on the internet, and that apparently is happening at a rate 7 to 1 for the users of this website. People know they can avoid the background check. What can be done to make sure that people online and looking for guns are not able to avoid a background check?
That's exactly why we need to pass H.R. 8, because the reference to private sales doesn't acknowledge that private sales now, unlicensed sellers, include online sales, include many sellers at gun shows, and include sales that are happening on the street. H.R. 8 would address this gaping loophole in our background check laws and ensure that all gun sales, including sales online, are run through a licensed gun dealer with a background check.
Thank you very much. Dr. Saccharin, in the early 1970s, Congress passed legislation spurred by a call to action surrounding a public health crisis. And shortly after Congress acted, President Richard Nixon signed the Public Health Cigarette Smoking Act, which bans cigarette ads from airing on television and radio in response to evidence highlighting the causal link between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. Now, gun violence in this country is a public health crisis that claims the lives of 100 Americans every day and injures hundreds more every day, resulting in a nation of gun violence survivors with the trauma that leaves them with. Gun violence in any form can have a lasting impact on individuals, not only emotionally, but also physically and financially. Now, do you agree that gun violence is a public health crisis in America? And how could we address the public health implications of gun violence similar as was done with smoking?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And that's such an important question, because one of the things that we haven't done when it comes to gun violence is treated it like a disease, treated it like the public health crisis that it is. And the tobacco analogy is great, but it's also, you can talk about obesity and so many other things. And as clinicians, we have a responsibility to be talking to our patients about, things like safe storage and other aspects. And what can we do? I think, one of the biggest gaps, and we heard about this, is the lack of funding. There's been essentially a moratorium on federal funding when it comes to firearm injury prevention research. And when you talk to, folks like Dr. Redfield, who's a CDC director, he will say, I'm happy to study it as long as Congress appropriates those dollars. So I think that's one thing that's so critical.
Thank you. And my time is just about up, but I would be remiss if I did not thank my colleague from California, Mike Thompson, for the years that he has spent leading our gun violence task force. He's here in the audience today, and thank you, Mike, for your hard work.
Thank you.
Mr. Gohmert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and do appreciate all the witnesses being here today. And I'm thrilled there's so much interest in this issue, because as has been said, I know everybody here wants to stop the gun violence. And as a former prosecutor and defense attorney and a judge, felony judge for over a decade, I've tried to remember any case. I can't remember any significant case I had out of the thousands where somebody went through the process of getting a gun legally to inflict the violence. We all want to stop the gun violence. I haven't heard anybody talk about the breakdown of the home, the breakdown in moral teachings. Those certainly have had an effect. And I know one of the most quoted numbers that we often hear, and we've heard again today, is that background checks have stopped over 3 million people from getting guns that shouldn't. That's the initial stop. It's difficult to get through all of the data, but it appears the best estimate is somewhere over 96% of those 3 million end up being able to get guns. That's just the initial stop. And in fact, a good indication is 2010 numbers. And these are sometimes difficult to get the exact figures, but from 2010, we know there were 76,000 denials, and the Obama administration only found 44 that actually were committing a crime by trying to get a gun illegally. So we want to all get to the same place. Here in D.C., where they have incredibly strict gun laws, it costs $125 to privately transfer a gun. People that are law-abiding, they'll pay the $125. Criminals will not. It will not stop the transfers among criminals, and that's really where we get. In Baltimore, we've heard about, it's $250. Heck, in Illinois, apparently it's a $450 to get qualified to have a concealed carry. And if H.R. 8 became law, and somebody called me or anybody and said, I'm scared to death, my former spouse or live-in or whomever has threatened me, and I think he's going to be coming sometime this week. Well, the law under H.R. 8 requires, before you can do a private transfer, before you can take them a gun to try to help them protect themselves, there has to be an imminent threat. So for someone to take a gun to somebody they love so they can protect themselves that week, they committed a crime, because you can't have an imminent threat for a week. So there are issues here. We all want to get to an end of gun violence, but I would like to ask Dr. Oh, and by the way, for victims, I mean, our heart goes out to whether it's a shooting, it's sexual assault. I mean, there were so many times that as a judge, I had to stoically do my job, but I would go back to my office with a broken heart for the victims. We know who does the real suffering, and we want to stop it. And I am thrilled that we have so many people that care so deeply. But Dr. Malcolm, in your information, you indicated in 2018, the FBI reported some 26,181,000 requests for background checks to purchase a gun. Has that increase in the number of requests led to an increase in violence?
No, it hasn't. In fact, for more than 20 years, the rate of gun homicides has gone down. It's gone up slightly the last couple of years, mostly because of these suicides. And while the number has gone up, the rate hasn't. So far more people are now allowed to conceal carry across the country, get a certificate to have a gun, but that hasn't resulted in what it was supposed to do for those people who were against it. They thought there'd be shootouts on OK Corral on every corner. People are very responsible. Law-abiding citizens are extremely responsible with that right and are using it to protect themselves.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
The time of the gentleman has expired. Ms. Jackson-Lee.
I thank the chairman. Let me likewise add my appreciation for all of the witnesses. And victims are in all of our hearts. But we are reminded that you are seeking action. Let me thank the March for Our Lives and the members who have encountered these horrific tragedies. I also want to acknowledge Chairman Thompson for the years of work. I've had the privilege of working with him, and that we've come to this point is very much attributable to his persistence. And I thank him. I thank Ms. Kelly as well. Having visited her district, Ms. Latimer, as you well know, Latimer, I have been at the memorial, and I will never forget. And we owe you a great deal of gratitude. I thank you so very much. Let me, Ms. Thomas, I might not get to ask you a question, but I do want to indicate that the Giffords Center has been the mainstay of data collection. And so I want to remind everyone the numbers that we have cited have come from this great work, 100 Americans dying every day. So that means as we sit here today, there are Americans being killed by guns. I believe your statistics of 3 million people effectively being stopped through gun checks, and the universal background check bill is a bill of common sense. That's all we've asked for. I want to ask Professor Thomas, let me do this. The Second Amendment is the language in particular, allow me just to read from the Constitution. It indicates a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. A simple process of background check, and I don't have a lot of time, Professor Malcolm, I'm going to direct a question to you. What in the Second Amendment is impacted through a simple, straightforward background check? How are you stopped from getting a gun? Would you be stopped from getting a gun through a background check?
I would not be stopped, but the people who are likely to misuse a gun would not go through a background check. So the background check is really affecting those people who are law-abiding citizens for the most part, and not those people on the streets.
But the law-abiding citizens would not be blocked from getting a gun through a background check. Is that correct?
If you make the background check cumbersome enough, like this new bill will, then I think it will.
You've not answered the question. You've not answered the question. The question is, what in the Second Amendment is infringed upon by a background check? We're not asking about the process and cumbersome. That has to be tested. This is a bill that indicates universal background check.
The process does interfere with people being able to get it. We've heard that there are expenses.
But we have no data to prove that. And so I think you're not connecting it. I would like to hear you say just the existence of a universal background check, not process, would violate the Second Amendment. Is that a yes or no?
Background check is a process, really, and you can make it cumbersome.
Does it violate the Second Amendment? Does it stop people from getting guns? It's not the point of who will not go through the process, is will it stop people from getting guns that you say are law-abiding citizens?
One of the members on the, one of the Republican members of your committee has pointed out that there are expenses in the states that have universal background checks.
I don't think you're answering the question.
Cannot afford.
Let me go to Chief Acevedo.
So it does.
I thank you very much, Professor. I don't think you're answering the question. It does not infringe upon the Second Amendment. Chief Acevedo and Dr. Saccharin, two questions, and I really want to question all the witnesses, but let me be very clear. Chief Acevedo, you're on the streets with your law enforcement. You believe in relational policing. How much guns impacting your officers, but also, as you walk the beat, impacting neighborhoods and mothers and fathers and children? That's my question to you, and I just want to get the question in for Dr. Saccharin. Dr. Saccharin, years ago I introduced a bill where the chief of surgeon from Texas Trauma from Texas Children's Hospital said at that time it cost them $67,000 to treat a gun victim, a child. That was 20 years plus ago. Would you be able to answer monetarily, just maybe not specifically, but the depth of cost, both in human tragedy, but dollars that we lose by not responding to gun violence in America? Chief, would you answer the question, please? And I ask the indulgence of the chair. Yes, Chief.
Thank you for the question. The gun violence impacts all big cities across the country and suburban America as well. And if you think about domestic violence, in the city of Houston last year, we had tragically 279 homicides. It went up by 10. And the driver, the greatest driver, 38% increase in domestic violence homicides, domestic violence murders, where we don't have enough tools across our country for police officers in those situations to temporarily remove firearms, to keep women safe and families safe and children safe. And so it is a significant problem. I think all you have to do is turn on your television, listen to the radio, listen to the scanners, and go to our emergency rooms, and you'll see that it's a significant problem.
Dr. Saccharin?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, because if
time of the member is expired, the witness is permitted to answer after the time of the member had expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. You're welcome. Chief Acevedo spoke after the time had expired. Our next witness, questioner is Mr. Getz. Oh, before Mr. Getz, I want to announce that the committee will recess at 12:30 for 1/2 hour for lunch, We will resume at 1 o'clock, and we will continue until there will be votes, which we expect on the floor sometime after 2, and if necessary, we'll reconvene right after those votes. Mr. Getz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ronald Silva was standing with a friend in his driveway when he was shot and killed by an illegal alien who had been previously deported. Agnes Gibney, who was De Silva's mother, said, "The guy who killed my son has a determinate sentence in prison, but I have a lifetime sentence of grief and pain." Alapomar Alamontario is an illegal alien from Mexico. He murdered Grant Rodenbach with a gun on January 22nd, 2015.
Committee will come to order. Continue with questioning the witnesses.
Mr. Chairman, before we continue.
For what purposes does the gentleman seek recognition?
I would just like to make a clarification. I know at the end there was some discussion concerning the effectiveness or lack of effectiveness there is by who or who may not have received funds in a certain time. And I think one of the things we got to be very careful of here is every witness that comes here will come representing who they represent and from the areas that they do. And some of the witnesses here would not have been probably called if they had not been participants in the political process for your side of the aisle or possibly my side of the aisle. These are things that happen and they are disclosed. I think throwing that out there, especially to witnesses or even other members, implying that something changes for them, I think we need to be very careful of. Otherwise, we can just start admitting the records of donations from groups that are testifying here today on contributions and everything else. We just need to keep this on level with people from their background, knowing their background. Let's all have an honest argument without questioning the motives of or the trajectory of the motives from folks that we have seen. And with that, I'll yield back.
I'll now recognize the gentleman from North Dakota, Mr. Armstrong.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And in my never-ending quest to educate people about the way we live in North Dakota, earlier this morning in H.R. 1, I was explaining that we're the only state in the nation without voter registration. So in quest to solve problems in other areas, we actually make it more difficult to do things in my state. And I will continue, I think, on that a little bit here, and I'm going to talk particularly about the exceptions. And it's obvious to someone who has spent his entire life hunting, and whether it's bow hunting, upland game hunting, or rifle, or big game hunting, that when people write exceptions to laws like this, we do it in a way that actually doesn't take into account the rural nature of places where I live. And North Dakota's a beautiful place. I invite anybody to come there whenever they can. Probably not today, it's 35 below wind chill. But when we're talking about how we designate exceptions to this H.R. 8, we're talking about exclusively at shooting ranges, shooting galleries, or other designated areas. And in the noble goal of trying to end gun violence in other areas, I just want everybody to be aware that we are creating felons out of every ranch, federal felons out of every ranch and farm kid in North Dakota. We do not have designated shooting ranges. We do not have shooting galleries. We borrow our buddy a rifle to shoot in a stubble field prior to them going hunting, or whether it's pheasant hunting, whether it's deer hunting, whether it's any of those areas. So when we are dealing with these issues, I want to make it perfectly clear that we are also creating significant burdens on a way of life to the entire Midwest population, not just in North Dakota. And I actually want to thank Congress for a couple things, and I can do this because I wasn't here when these passed, so it's not self-gratifying. H.R. 4477, which was the Fix NICS Act of 2017, was passed. And this is how we approach gun law. North Dakota has incredibly pro-Second Amendment law, but what we do with our law enforcement and our state policy is absolutely go after prohibited people. We do everything we can to make sure law-abiding citizens can use their Second Amendment rights, but we continually work with domestic violence groups, law enforcement, to ensure that prohibited people don't have access to the firearms they're supposed to. And the Fix NICS Act was something that even in as pro-Second Amendment state as North Dakota, we have been utilized. Also, H.R. 4909, which is the Stop School Violence Act, is provided programs that are utilized in North Dakota right now. Our rural schools, some of them have been built in 1950s, and when we deal with school safety, we oftentimes don't have, it's not a matter of whether we have a school resource officer in one school in the community, we often don't have law enforcement that can respond within 45 minutes of some of our rural towns. So these grants help us provide school safety divided into the scenarios in which they exist at that point in time. So I would like to thank Congress for those. I would argue personally that the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act, which has passed the House and hasn't gotten through the Senate, is also a way to help deter more gun crime. And finally, I would just say, as somebody who's practiced criminal defense in federal court, I think just as a matter of statutory construction, we should be a little careful about the number of adjectives we use in the criminal code. Adjectives are a petri dish for trial lawyers, and purely outside of any partisanship or anything else, when we use a lot of ly words, they tend to be litigated in front of 12 people very extensively. But I do have one question for Ms. Thomas, and when you were talking to Congressman Klein earlier, you were talking about this being an important act and that without a registry, it doesn't matter. Under President Obama administration, they received a white paper from Greg Ridgway, and essentially the white paper says that these gun laws do not work without a national registry. So my question is, was the Obama administration wrong?
I'm not sure exactly what you're asking, but if your question is whether or not it's appropriate to pass H.R. 8 without a registry, my answer would be yes, it is absolutely incumbent on us to pass H.R. 8, even though it prohibits a registry from being formed, because it will encompass a larger majority of background checks on all gun sales than what we have in place now.
Okay, and forgive me because my old criminal defense attorney mind's coming in place, but that without the registry, how is it enforceable?
Because every sale and transfer of a gun requires a background check, so when guns are recovered in crimes, it will be much easier for law enforcement to discover if guns haven't had a background check on them and to trace them back to their original source. And in that instance, it would be very easy to know if there was no background check conducted.
Yeah, I'd ask for unanimous consent to offer this summary of select firearm violence prevention strategies by Greg Ridgway into the record. And
without objection, the document will be entered into the record.
And I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Thank you. Now recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I want to first recognize my wonderful constituent, Andrea Chambly, who's here today. She lost her husband, John McNamara, in the terrible massacre that took place in Annapolis. He was a reporter and a celebrated editor of the Capital Gazette. Thank you for joining us, Andrea. And you stand for hundreds of people here today who've lost family members and friends, and hundreds of thousands across the country who are begging us to do something. Mr. Nadler, thank you for this hearing, which is extraordinary because it's the first hearing on gun violence in more than 8 years in the House of Representatives. In that time, we've seen not only the daily mounting gruesome death toll in every community across America, where 96 people die from gun violence every day, and 246 every day are shot and wounded, where 8 children or teens die from gun violence every day, and where 39 young people are shot and wounded. But over the last 8 years, we've seen 6 of the 10 worst gun massacres in the history of the United States of America. The Las Vegas massacre with 58 dead, the Pulse nightclub massacre with 49 dead, Sandy Hook, 20 kids and 6 grown-ups, Stoneman Douglas, 17 adults, and on and on. And to the wonderful people who've assembled here today, taking time off from school, off from work to come to bear witness to the people you've lost in your lives, I want to say that you are the repositories of the memories of your loved ones, but we are the repositories of the legislative memories of what has happened here. And we must never forget. I've only been here for 2 years, but I want to tell you in that time, I saw several of those massacres, including the Vegas massacre and the Stoneman Douglas massacre, and we had not a single hearing on a universal criminal background check. We had 3 hearings in this committee with Diamond and Silk to talk about imaginary offenses online. And they brought us two bills. One, the aforementioned bill, the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act, a complete misnomer. It has nothing to do with reciprocity. It would demolish every state's concealed carry law so that if you can get a gun in the most permissive state in the union, which I think is still Florida, where 1.5 million people have the right to carry a loaded concealed weapon, then you can go anywhere in the country. That's what they brought us. Oh, and they brought us one other bill, which was to legalize silencers in America. That sounds not like a common sense public safety agenda. That sounds like a mafia agenda, to legalize silencers across the country. That is what we have dealt with in this committee, which is why today is such a remarkable breath of fresh air and why Americans across the country are looking at the House of Representatives with hope today. Now, the universal criminal background check is backed by more than 95% of the American people, the vast majority of Democrats, the vast majority of Republicans, independents, gun owners. Everybody thinks that you should not be able to purchase a firearm in America if you can't pass a simple criminal and mental background check. So we're screening out felons and fugitives, people who are violently unstable, undocumented aliens. These are the people that we're trying to catch. And what do we hear from the other side? We hear, well, this punishes law-abiding people. You should go after the criminals. That's precisely what we're trying to do. We're trying to keep them from getting guns in the first place. We are trying to close the loopholes here today. Now, we're hearing that there's a lot of Second Amendment verbiage floating around the room, and yet I have yet to hear a single argument that this legislation in H.R. 8 is unconstitutional. Not one. Now, the distinguished ranking member of the committee, I think, was offended by the gentleman from New York's line of questioning about Professor Malcolm's background and the character of her professorship at George Mason. Fine, if you're not interested in trying to determine the sources of the income for her chairmanship, let's leave that to the side. Let's go to the content of Professor Malcolm's testimony. Professor Malcolm, I'm a fellow professor of constitutional law, so I was all excited for your testimony because before I was a member of Congress, I loved nothing more than to be able to do a legal analysis and bring it to Congress and say, here's my understanding of what the law is. But I searched in vain your entire testimony for any legal analysis of the Second Amendment constitutionality of H.R. 8. And I'm wondering, have you written a separate law review article or a separate legal analysis? Because I understand this is more of a policy statement.
I have not written an analysis of this particular bill, but I would like to say that I deeply resent the assertion that I am a wholly owned subsidiary.
I didn't say anything about that.
I know you didn't.
Okay, well, I'm sorry, I'm going to reclaim my time because we have very little time here. Let me go to this question. Do you have an opinion as the Second Amendment chairholder at the George Mason Antonin Scalia School of Law, do you have a legal opinion that you have formed, even without an analysis that's written, as to the constitutionality of H.R. 8?
I have a legal opinion that the constitutional right that is associated with the instant background check as it now stands is constitutional. It just doesn't work very well.
Okay, so
it doesn't work
all right,
very
we'll go to the ATF for their thoughts on that. But you're saying as a constitutional matter, the legislation before us is perfectly constitutional today. And Dr. Sacron, do you agree with that? That H.R. 8 is perfectly constitutional?
I'm not a lawyer, and I'm here in my capacity as a trauma surgeon. But we currently have licensing that is actually evaluating people for background checks. So this is just talking about ensuring we close those loopholes and expand that to the rest of the public. So
okay, and it doesn't deny anybody the right to access a gun who has a Second Amendment right to get one. It's only the people that Justice Scalia enumerated in the Heller decision as being not eligible because they might be mentally defective or felons or fugitives and so on, right?
Correct.
That's your understanding of it. Okay. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Thank the gentleman. I now recognize the gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal. Who's not here? Correa. The gentleman from California, Mr. Correa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to thank you for holding this most important hearing. And of course, I want to also thank all the young people in the audience today. This is your day. And I'm glad you're here and forced to show that you care about this issue. A lot of you here have also been painfully touched, personally touched by a loss due to gun violence, and thank you also for being here. I thank the panelists also for your expert testimony today. And Ms. Lindquist, I want to personally thank you as well for bravery, for being here to tell us about that horrible experience of yours. Half dozen years ago, my wife was attacked, mugged, and like in your situation, somebody came up behind her and grabbed her and threw her down and beat her up. And I can tell you for many, many months, I was there helping her nurse back her wounds, not only the physical, but the emotional that she still carries. We don't wish that on anybody. Very, very tough issue here. Professor Malcolm, you're absolutely right. This is going to make it a little more expensive for somebody to purchase a weapon. The bureaucratic issues involved are going to slow down the process. So I think about this bill, I think back to my district, where I've had to attend many funerals, way too many funerals, of young people, very young teenagers, being the victims of gang violence. And as I think about your testimony here, is this bill going to stop somebody from buying a gun illegally?
I don't think so. I can't see how it will.
I don't think it does. I don't think it does. Yet, as I think about society today, what goes on in our streets, I'm going to come back to something that the Chief Acevedo said, which is a question in my mind is, will this legislation save a life? Will it save one life? Because when I have constituents that have been touched, that have been hurt by gun violence, my question is, Chief Acevedo, is this bill going to save one life or many lives? Or none at all?
No, thank you for the question. This bill will definitely save lives. There's no doubt about it. What this bill does is not keep guns out of the hands of law-abiding Americans of sound mind, which I don't know if anyone...
What was that? What did you just...
It will not keep firearms out of the hands of law-abiding Americans of sound mind. What it will do is make it more difficult for those that use these loopholes at gun shows, on the internet, straw purchasers, that are driven by greed, that then go out and purchase these firearms and then sell them to those crooks. It's going to make it more difficult for the bad guys. And we're going to support the good guys with guns, and we're going to talk about other good guys with guns. We also need to talk about what do we do to keep guns out of the bad guys with guns. And this is exactly what this bill will do. That's why the major city chiefs has been very vocal. The mayors have been very vocal. Prosecutors have been very vocal. And I would like to tell you to the folks that are in our emergency rooms that thanks to the medicine, the quality of the medicine we have today, the scourge of gun violence and the deaths from it would be quite more horrifying than we experience. I want to say to the trauma docs, you are in your lane. Stay in the lane, which is saving lives, not selling guns.
Thank you very much. Same question to Major Tapp Harper. Both of you have been on the beat. You are where the rubber meets the road. You've seen that violence. Will this bill, will this legislation, H.R. 8, save lives?
Thank you for your question, sir. And our primary responsibility is preservation of life, and I stand arm in arm with the chief. Yes, I believe that we will save lives.
And so this legislation is really a major step forward in keeping guns away from those that are really not qualified to own a gun. Mr. Chair, I yield.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Richmond is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Malcolm, I believe two people earlier said that none of these bills would do anything to save a life. But if we look at the Charleston loophole, wouldn't that have prevented the perpetrator from purchasing that gun?
And excuse me, what?
The Charleston loophole, the loophole that says if your background check does not come back in 72 hours, then you automatically can purchase the firearm. In his case, his background check came back after 4 days, and what came back would have prevented him from being able to buy the gun, which in my mind, therefore, would have prevented the Emanuel 9 massacre in Mother Emanuel Church and the loss of 9 lives. So my question is, that is closing that loophole would have saved 9 lives.
In that one case, it probably would, but there are very few people like that man who actually go through the whole process knowing that they're planning to misuse a firearm.
Well, may be and may not, because I think he had a bad address. So logic would tell me that if you go in and you give a little bit of bad information, like an incorrect address that may delay the background check from coming back, the goal is for the background check to come back after 72 hours and you can purchase your gun. Also, people like to point out the assault weapons ban and what effect that had. Let me tell you what effect it had, because I was young in those days, and I lived in the hot streets during the 90s. That assault weapons ban made the price of a Uzi go up from $400 in a store to $1,500. And therefore, that mad person may have had $400 in his pocket, but not $1,500. And it delayed the time in which he could get his hands on a gun legally or illegally, which allowed for a cooling period to happen. And I hear many people say that this may put a burden on lawful gun owners, which I'm one. And when I went to purchase my gun, I did not need it immediately. If I had to wait 2 days, that was okay. The person who needs a gun right then and there is probably the person we don't want with a gun right then and there. But let me just remind this committee of what I believe was a missed opportunity back in 1990, the same time when the streets were hot because of crack cocaine. This body, this committee, this Congress decided that it would treat the crack cocaine epidemic in a different way, that it would find the cure to it in mass incarceration. What we didn't do is treat it as the substance abuse problem that it was. Had we declared it a health epidemic back in 1990, guess what would have happened? We'd have substance abuse clinics and infrastructure all across this country. And the opioid victims that we see today would have a place to go because we would have responded correctly back in 1990. Now, the question is, why am I saying that? Because we have an opioid epidemic. And the president just declared it a public health crisis. And last year, opioids, we lost 14,000 individuals. Synthetic opioids, 28,000. Heroin, 15,000. It is a health epidemic. But last year, we lost 39,773 people to gun violence, which is a health epidemic. And the question becomes, let's assume I'm wrong, Dr. Malcolm. Let's assume it's not. But what harm is there in trying to figure out the link between guns and the violence and letting CDC and NIH, smart people who are doctors, who are smarter than me, what's wrong with letting them study it to come back to us with recommendations? Because that's what we're doing with the opioid epidemic. I don't want us to come here in 20 years like I'm doing now and somebody saying they had a chance to remove the Dickey Amendment, allow NIH, CDC, and experts to study it, but they didn't do it during that time because the pressure was too hot. And now 20 years later, we're gone down a road and we're losing so many kids. So please tell me, what's the harm in studying it?
Guns are not a disease. They should be studied by people who are law enforcement, who know more about crime on the streets, of all of the other kinds of possibilities. And also there's a right, a constitutional right for ordinary people to protect themselves with firearms. There is no right to have an opioid, and it's a good idea that there isn't, because you're right, it's a terrible epidemic. But doctors are not the best ones to be studying the best solutions for gun control. What I would like to see, and this committee, or at least the Congress has taken it up in the past, is something more done to help people who are dangerously mentally ill. And I think that would be a tremendous help, because most of the people who have committed these mass murders are people who really need some kind of help. And we have dismantled our health establishment and not really put anything very good in its place. And while it's not a very sexy subject, I think it would be a tremendous help to try to help them.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record? It's an annotation from Dr. Sacron's testimony where it says firearm injury and death in America is not only a disease, and it references, what I'd like to enter into the record is by Lerner Hargarden, Gun Violence, a Biopsychosocial Disease.
Without objection, the material will be entered into the record. Ms. Jayapal is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to start by saying thank you to all of you. I know this has been a long day, but I especially want to thank those of you in the audience who are survivors of gun violence, who are family members. I want to thank you, Alea, for your excellent testimony. The reality is you all are putting this issue on the map, and I am so deeply grateful for that. I just have to, before I get into my questions, say to Professor Malcolm, with all due respect, seatbelts were not considered a public health crisis initially. Cigarettes were not either, but we took on smoking, we took on seatbelts, as Dr. Sacron said, and that is what we need to do with gun violence. Every day we know 109 people are killed by gun violence, hundreds more are injured, and I wanted to call attention to the fact that every 16 hours a woman is killed by an abuser with a firearm. And in the United States today, 4.5 million women have been threatened by an abuser with a firearm. I'm proud to be from Washington State, where we have consistently passed some of the most sweeping gun reform pieces of legislation and initiatives, including comprehensive background checks in 2014. In 2016, allowing courts to issue extreme risk protection orders, as many of you have spoken about, and then most recently in 2018, raising the legal age to purchase a semi-automatic rifle to 21 and requiring safe storage. In 2014, we passed a law allowing courts to ask domestic violence perpetrators to surrender their firearms when judges determine that they're a credible threat. Seattle and King County established a regional domestic violence firearms enforcement unit that in 2018 collected over 466 firearms, potentially saving the lives of countless survivors of domestic violence and others. I read, Professor Malcolm, that you have said some things that imply, or perhaps outright say, that repossession of firearms could lead to the government repossessing other things, such as fire extinguishers. That so-called slippery slope argument is really a tremendous disservice, and so I just wanted to give you a chance to tell me if you believe that repossessing firearms from people under court order to surrender their firearms is going to result in the police repossessing fire extinguishers. And you
I never wrote that. I never did.
And so that is untrue.
That's
untrue. You do not believe in that slippery slope argument. Great.
No.
So you have also asserted that women should carry guns for their own protection because, and I believe this is your quote, government can't protect everybody. People have to be able to protect themselves. Is that correct? And again, a yes or no answer. Yes. A yes. Okay. So let me turn to you, Major Tapp Harper, as the commander of the Domestic Violence Unit for the Baltimore City Sheriff's Office. Do you agree with Professor Malcolm's position that victims of domestic violence will be safer if they have guns?
I'd like to point to what the national statistics say on this, and specifically what Dr. Jacqueline Campbell says. And what she says, quote, is, and what about the notion that if women were armed, they'd be safer? In a survey of women in a shelter, fewer than 1 in 20 abused women who had access to a gun reported having ever used it in self-defense against their abuser. In another national study, owning a handgun neither increased nor decreased abused women's risk of being killed by a partner. A third study showed that among California purchasers of handguns, women who purchased handguns had a 50% increase in risk of homicide, all of which could be attributed to homicide by an intimate partner. While this study cannot
let me just stop you right there. I'm sorry, I'm running out of time, but that was just what I was looking for. And so let me just ask a question of Dr. Is it Sacron or Sacron? Saccharin, okay, great. Last year, when we became the first state in the country to pass a bill allowing people at high risk of suicide to voluntarily register themselves to temporarily suspend their ability to purchase a firearm, I want to go to that. In your experience as Director of Emergency General Surgery at Johns Hopkins, do you think there is more that we should be doing to prevent suicide by firearm?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So this is such an important piece because I think it's been glossed over during the discussion this afternoon. Actually, most firearm deaths are from suicide, and people keep dismissing that. Yeah. Suicide is actually a violent death that people commit to themselves. When you look at the healthcare community, we actually often don't see a lot of these victims because they're going straight to the morgue. Why is that? Because there's such a high case fatality rate that exists when you try to commit suicide using a firearm versus if you're taking, pills and trying to overdose. It's completely disparate. And so absolutely we should be doing more. Our families, our community needs to be involved in that process, which is why different pieces of legislation like you've done in Washington is useful.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back, and I'm looking forward to much more work on this topic.
Thank you. Ms. Scanlon.
It's been 8 years and hundreds of thousands of lives lost to gun violence since the last time Congress held a hearing on this issue. And while Congress has shirked its responsibility to address the epidemic of gun violence, the grassroots demand for action has taken root and been so well represented here today. We're at a critical moment where we can save the lives of thousands of Americans, and if we can, I think we must. This isn't a Second Amendment issue. This is a public health crisis. As the gentleman from Maryland and Florida pointed out, the common sense measures that Congress is considering all pass constitutional muster, even under the restrictive reading of the Constitution espoused by the late Justice Scalia. I grew up in a family where responsible gun ownership was common, a family of veterans and hunters who understood the value of safe gun policies. But those aren't the individuals we're talking about here today. We're talking about the background checks we need to keep firearms out of the hands of criminals and gun traffickers, keeping weapons of war off the street, and keeping illegal guns out of our community. And as several people have suggested, how we can help keep guns out of the hands of those who represent a danger to themselves or others. We need a multifaceted approach to address a multi-pronged public health program, one that in the terms of the breadth and depth of its impact on Americans could legitimately be declared a national emergency. It's a problem that demands a research-based and data-driven response, as suggested by the law enforcement and medical professionals who've testified here today. I want to take a moment to address two of my constituents attending today's hearing who've turned their personal tragedies into advocacy. Beverly Wright lost her son to random gun violence when he was just 23 years old. She has since started support groups for families in my district who've been impacted by gun violence. I was struck last night and again this morning when Beverly and other families of gun violence victims greeted each other with hugs as though they were close associates. But then I realized that's exactly what they are. They're members of an ever-growing club that no one wants to be a member of. I want to thank them for their tireless advocacy to make sure that their club does not keep growing. My other guest is Malcolm Yates, who was just 7 years old when he survived a shooting at a Philadelphia candy store that claimed the life of his 5-year-old brother. He has since started a foundation and a community center in his brother's name and has become a community activist. I was proud to have Malcolm and Beverly as my guests at the State of the Union last night, and I'm even prouder that they're here today at this historic hearing. They know what some still refuse to acknowledge, that thoughts and prayers after shootings are not enough, that gun violence has become a constant in too many of our communities, invading our streets, our offices, our places of worship, and our schools. It is time for our collective outrage to drive common sense gun legislation and for that legislation to become law. Before I get to my questions, I want to echo my colleagues in thanking the chairman for having this important hearing and thanking our witnesses for being here and sharing their stories and expertise. To that end, Major Tapp Harper, my district is in southeastern Pennsylvania, and as such, we're impacted by what some call the iron pipeline, seeing guns from southern states with weak gun safety laws travel to our city streets in Pennsylvania. Can you speak to how better tracking of lost or stolen guns can help prevent this phenomenon and decrease gun violence?
I think universal laws that I talked about earlier and strengthening those federal laws is the way. I think that's the way to keep everybody safe, as I mentioned earlier.
Okay. And Chief Acevedo, how can the federal government, including the ATF, be more involved and active in stemming the problem of gun trafficking? How can we help local law enforcement? It'll go back in.
Can you move that other mic over there, perhaps? No. Or that one?
You have to slide the brown box over.
Sorry about that. I'll fix it here in a sec. Oh, you fixed it? Thank you. You get an assist. Well, first of all, we need to get ATF up and running. It is an open secret amongst law enforcement circles that Congress has handcuffed the ATF. And so if Congress is interested in fighting gun violence, we need to properly fund the ATF, increase the number of agents on the ground on ATF, and actually go after all the illegal guns. They are a phenomenal partner. I think they're underappreciated, but sadly, I don't think the American people know what a great asset that organization is and how much is being underutilized as a result of a lack of funding and support from Congress.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Garcia of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too want to thank the audience. I know we started out at 10 o'clock, and here we are. Who can do the math real quickly? About 4 or 5 hours later. So thanks for hanging on to us with us. And to Ms. Eastwood and Ms. Lindquist, thank you so much for sharing. I know it takes a lot of courage to come before us and share your stories. Please know that we all were genuinely touched, and we certainly stand with you in trying to make changes in both of the areas that you both talked about. Chief, I wanted to start with you. I know this is not an immigration hearing, although it began to sound like one earlier, but there was a comment made about criminal aliens, which of course is a word, as my colleague from Houston, that I find very offensive. And there was a question that there was a statement made that implied that every unauthorized immigrant that comes to this country quickly goes to get a gun and starts committing some heinous crime. I know you track a lot of this because I've heard your stats in Houston. And could you tell us, comparatively speaking, in terms of the crimes committed by unauthorized immigrants versus non-immigrants?
Well, thank you. I mean, first, I really started to think it was an immigration hearing when Mr. Gates started speaking earlier, and then I thought I was being forgotten, like the children that have been taken from their mothers for seeking asylum in the United States, who we can't seem to find or account for. But let me just be real clear. Every study that we've seen will show that undocumented immigrants are underrepresented in terms of their commission of crimes. Most of those individuals are here to seek a better way of life, like every one of our ancestors. Mr. Getz gave us a handful and attributed them to undocumented immigrants, yet my testimony included mass shooting events in the United States occurring between June 2015 to January 2019.
You had the whole list.
Yes, and that included 41 mass shootings with 251 Americans killed, 1,095 injured, and to my knowledge, I don't believe a single one of those shooters were undocumented immigrants. So I think we need to keep that in mind. Having said that, undocumented immigrants should not be able to possess or actually purchase guns And by not supporting this legislation, we're not only making it easier for those undocumented immigrants that are actually criminal immigrants that actually prey on other immigrants and others, and terrorists from getting firearms. So if we really want to keep firearms out of the hands of undocumented immigrants, we know that whether we build the wall or not, they're going to go under the wall, through the wall, over the wall, but we know that you're not going to keep them all out, and so we need to do everything we can to keep firearms in the hands of law-abiding Americans of sound mind, and that's what this legislation helps to do.
Thank you, Chief. And now to the doctor. I read in your written testimony that you suggest that there's about a $221 billion, and that's billion with a B, in economic costs to the medical healthcare system in dealing with the violence and the trauma care that you must provide. And I must tell you that I signed up for a doctor for a day program with the Bentop Hospital in Houston. I'm sure you know it. It's a world-known trauma center. And I got to be in the surgery room when a gunshot victim came in, and I watched the whole surgery. I think they were surprised because a lot of people see a lot of blood for the first time and they faint. I did not faint. I got through it. What is the economic impact? Is that the latest figure for when? And about how much is it like per victim that comes in?
Well, thank you for that question, and I'm glad that you had the opportunity to experience what we're seeing, every day when it comes to these gunshot wound victims. When you look at if the human impact is not enough, there is an economic impact, as you allude to. The economic impact actually is very difficult to narrow down. So we did a study just published last year in Health Affairs that essentially found that about the cost is about $2.8 billion. And this is just the cost of patients that are coming to the hospital after having been shot. When you look at the societal cost, that's even more tremendous. And there's figures over $220 billion that is out there in the literature that's stated. And so it's hard to, kind of really narrow that down because there's a lot of things that you have to take into factor. Can they go back to work and other societal aspects? But it's a significant economic impact to our healthcare system and to our country.
So not only is it a public health issue, it's an economic issue.
Absolutely. I mean, some of those figures, they're more than some of our departments and administrations are actually spending when you look at Department of Education and so forth. So just think about that for a second and think about all of that, essentially economic funds that are going to waste, not to mention people not being able to get back and integrate into society.
Well, thank you, and thank you so much for staying in your lane.
Thank you. The time of the gentlelady has expired. Mr. Neguse is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for hosting this important hearing, and thank you to the witnesses, the survivors, the many folks who are gathered here today, and particularly the young folks, the activists with Moms Demand Action, so many people that have been highlighting this issue. We appreciate your activism and your service. I also want to make sure I recognize a constituent of mine back home, the founder of Moms Demand Action, Shannon Watts, who happens to live in Boulder, Colorado, where I represent and hail from, and who has led on this issue for so many years. And I'm proud to represent her and so many others in Colorado that have been touched by this issue. I, as I mentioned, have the great honor of representing the state of Colorado, and we have had countless tragedies of gun violence in our state. Some folks earlier mentioned Columbine High School in 1999, which killed 15, to the shooting in a movie theater in Aurora, Colorado in 2012, in which 12 people perished, along with countless others every day incidents of gun violence. At the time of the shooting at Columbine, I was 14 years old. I lived 10 minutes away and 10 miles away from that high school. But it is not my story that I want to share today. There are many survivors who have waited quite some time to have their experiences heard and acknowledged and true recognition given to this issue. And so I want to share one of their stories before I jump into my questions. A young man, Daniel Mauser, was killed in the Columbine shooting. He was roughly my age, 15 years old at the time. This April 20th, in just 2 months, will mark the 20th anniversary of the tragedy at Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado. I spoke to Daniel's father yesterday, Tom Mauser, and he recounted the story to me, that just 2 weeks before the tragedy, 15-year-old Daniel asked his father a question at the dinner table, reflecting on a conversation in his debate class. He said, "Dad, did you know there are loopholes in the Brady Bill?" 2 weeks later, Daniel was killed at Columbine High School with a gun purchased through one of those loopholes. Daniel's father, Tom, remains haunted by that question today and by the hole in our gun laws that allowed his son to be killed. He has committed his life to championing this issue ever since his son's death. And when Tom first began sharing his story, he wore his son's shoes to speak with people, telling people that he had taken his son's place in the great debate about gun violence. Months after the Columbine tragedy, Colorado voters overwhelmingly voted to close the background check loophole, and many other states have since followed suit. The American people understand that we need to keep firearms out of the wrong hands, and yet it is 20 years later, and we at the federal level have shamefully done nothing about this issue. That is why I am so excited to support H.R. 8 and so grateful to the sponsors, to Representative Thompson, the folks in the Gun Violence Prevention Task Force for leading on this issue. With that, I want to ask a question around extreme risk protection orders and red flag orders. I know it's been discussed at some length by the committee. As some folks may know, my home state of Colorado will soon take up similar legislation, and I support that legislation. I'm hoping we can work on that issue in this committee. But my question is for Major Tapp Harper. As a state that has enacted similar legislation, if you could just speak to some of the impacts that the legislation has had in your state.
Right, so this past year, Maryland just got the extreme risk protective order, and the importance of getting that, it now gives law enforcement officers and other individuals the option of getting protective orders, where in the past it was limited to certain family members and individuals who were married to a person. Otherwise, it would have to be a peace order. So that was very important. And the other thing is, if law enforcement officers see certain behaviors distributed, they can then go and get a protective order for that individual, and they can get the weapons from the home. So that's really important for us.
Thank you, Major Tapp Harper. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield the rest of my time, with your approval, to my colleague, Ms. Macbeth, because I believe her story is certainly one that we need to hear and want to make sure she has ample time to do so.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you very much to my colleague. During testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee just a couple of weeks ago, Attorney General nominee William Barr said these words. He said, "We need to push along extreme risk protection orders, ERPOs, so that we have these red flag laws to supplement the use of background checks to find out if someone has a mental disturbance. This is the single most important thing that we can do in the gun control area to stop these mass shootings from happening in the first place." And I'd also like to say that Senator Graham and Senator Blumenthal introduced a bipartisan federal extreme risk law in the Senate last year that I also plan to develop for introduction in the House with my colleagues, hopefully very soon.
Ms. Macbeth, the gentleman's time has expired, but I will go ahead and recognize you for your time. The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Major Tapp Harper, do you agree with the Attorney General nominee that extreme risk law should be the top priority for gun violence prevention?
I do agree that extreme risk protective order laws are very important. There are several states that already have them, and the ones that don't, just as I mentioned earlier, with those federal laws, we need to become consistent as a country, and we need to get those laws in effect across the nation. So yes, I do think it's very important.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman? Go ahead. Do you want me to go ahead? Okay. Okay. Also, and all right, thank you. And the Binkleys know that Florida already has an extreme risk law in place when their daughter was murdered. These were the
The couple that I spent time with last night with the State of the Union address, they were my guests. They still believe in their potential of the extreme risk protection orders. They still believe in the potential alongside better officer training or more research into authentic makers of the dangerousness of these laws. Dr. Saccharin, how could Congress support the implementation of extreme risk laws?
Well, I think one thing that is important to recognize is, passing the legislation is one piece, but also raising education and awareness that actually is present is another. Thousand Oaks is another example where, that could have potentially been enforced. California has the ERPO laws, and these laws have been used in the past to, prevent suicide and other forms of gun violence. And we have other states where we've seen this, like Vermont, where, 2 months after the Parkland massacre, when it was implemented, they actually stopped an 18-year-old kid from, proceeding with a mass shooting that was going to happen at a high school, and that was all documented. So I think passing the legislation is important, but also ensuring that we're raising awareness about it and people understand it and they know how to proceed and enact it is very critical.
Thank you. And Ms. Eastman, I'm so sorry. I was out of the room earlier when you gave your testimony, and I do apologize for not having been here. But I'd just like to thank you so much for your bravery. I cannot tell you how important your being here and all of the students and gun violence survivors, and I applaud you for being here. I just wanted to give you another chance to speak if you had anything else that you wanted to say, because your voice is extremely critical and we need to hear more from you.
Thank you. I do believe that it's important that we continue to have hearings like this, and I strongly urge you guys to have a hearing again, but particularly to address gun violence in urban communities, because that hasn't been touched upon nearly enough during this hearing today. Again, Black and brown youth are disproportionately impacted by gun violence, and they are the #1 people impacted by gun violence. And we cannot continue to have hearings and not address those issues. So I do urge you guys to have another one, particularly for gun violence in marginalized communities. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
The gentlelady yields back. Thank you very much. I recognize the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Stanton, for 5 minutes.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing today. It's been a great hearing with outstanding testimony. It's my honor to serve on this committee and to sit next to Congresswoman McBath. And when this Congress finally does pass H.R. 8, I think we will, it'll honor you. It'll honor Congresswoman Giffords. It'll honor survivors of gun violence. It'll honor the family and friends of victims of gun violence. It'll be the right thing to do. Before I joined this distinguished body, I spent 6 years as a big city mayor of Phoenix, Arizona. There's a lot of big challenges in that job and even a few fears. But there is nothing that I feared more than when I get a call of a mass shooting in my city. We were lucky in Phoenix. Many other communities were not. Aurora, Newtown, Charleston, San Bernardino, Orlando, Las Vegas, Sutherland Springs, Parkland, Pittsburgh, Thousand Oaks. The list goes on and on. And it pains me, Mr. Chairman, that between the time when the first shot rang out at Newtown to today, this body has not held a single hearing, not a single hearing on what we can do to reduce gun violence until today. The American people deserve better. My community, like every American community, is not immune from gun violence. I can tell you that my darkest and hardest days as mayor were delivered at the hand of gun violence. Police officers were murdered by those who shouldn't have had a gun. Women and children were gunned down in acts of domestic violence by someone who should not have had a gun. I've mourned with family members who've lost loved ones to gun violence. I've worked alongside survivors and advocates whose lives have been torn apart and stitched back together again after encountering their worst fears. Our nation stops when there is a mass shooting, but here's the cold reality. Gun violence happens every single day in America. It takes lives every single day, but has become so commonplace that it doesn't make headlines. We're here today to examine a public health crisis in our nation. Throughout my public service, I've met with people from all walks of lives, people from both sides of the aisle, and they all agree that we must do something to stop this violence, to stop innocent people from dying. Democrats and Republicans alike respect gun rights and are in favor of common sense gun laws. These are not competing values. 97% of Americans support background checks for every gun sale. 97%. That means gun owners, Republicans, they all support background checks, and that support is overwhelming. Background checks on all gun sales are the backbone of any comprehensive gun violence prevention plan. And for me, this is where we come together to make a difference. As difficult as it has been to hear the powerful testimony from our witnesses here today, we have a responsibility to listen and to not look away. There is a thread that weaves these experiences together. Too many guns are being used against innocent people, and too many ill-gotten guns are being used against innocent people, and we must put an end to it. And that's why this hearing is important, and the action that this committee is going to take in the next few days and weeks is very important. I do have time for maybe one or two questions. Ms. Thomas, I want to ask you about the NICS Act and the attempt to sort of fix the NICS Act. There are some loopholes remaining in that H.R. 8 would fill in. I wanted to inform this committee and maybe the public as to how H.R. 8 will help fix some of those loopholes.
Well, part of the problem that we're dealing with background checks is that while you go to a licensed gun dealer and the dealer conducts a background check, there's so many places where unlicensed dealers, and it's often called private sales, but the truth is it's not really just private sales. It's any sale by someone who's not choosing to be a licensed dealer. And those sales have really spread to the point where we don't even really know exactly where they're happening. We certainly know that they're happening through online sales like Arms List, which was referenced earlier. We certainly know they're happening at gun shows. Anyone who's been to a gun show knows that there are tables that say no background check required, where unlicensed dealers sell their guns and you don't need to take a background check. And they can be sold legally out of the trunk of a car on a corner without background checks in most states. So what this law does is it requires that whether you are a private seller, whether you're selling online, whether you're at a gun show, whether you're a licensed dealer, all of those transfers happen through a licensed dealer and include a background check. They will help us keep guns out of the hands of dangerous people and then enable us to look at next steps. Enforcing something like an extreme risk protective order also requires universal background checks, because without that in place, it's very difficult to keep individuals from acquiring new guns. So it is basically the floor that allows us to then look at all the other ways that we need to regulate guns in order to keep our community safer.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. The time of the gentleman has expired. Ms. Dean of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to join my colleagues in saying that today is a day of action, and it's a day of extraordinary hope. I want to thank all of you for being here. And for those who don't know, there's an overflow room of other members who came, activists, family members, victims who came. They wanted to be a part of this. So I thank you, those in the ante room, for being here and for remaining all these hours. I think about it, and I think about the time of our work in this day. And from the time we got up this morning until the time we'll go to bed tonight, another 300 people in this country will be shot, wounded, or killed. 100 people today will die of gun violence as we do our work or as we fail to do our work. 200 more will be wounded, literally caught in the crossfire. That's not just today. That's yesterday, that's tomorrow. And yet last night, we listened to a State of the Union address by the leader of the free world, the leader of this great democracy, that mentioned nothing about gun violence, about the scourge of gun violence that wounds or kills a total of 120,000 people a year. It is stunning. And for somebody to have testified that there's just been a small uptick in violence and in gun deaths, when 2 years ago there were 33,000 people who died of gun violence. Last year it was 40,000 people died, more than half to suicide. I don't call that a small uptick. If it's one more, it's not a small uptick if it's my family member. I want to thank in particular my guest who came with me last night, Ms. Jamie Amo. Jamie is a survivor of Columbine. She was a freshman that fateful day, and she described to me the fear, the sounds, the haunting hiding, and trying to figure out where was a safe haven. And she is now a young mother of 3 and an advocate, and I'm so proud of you, Jamie. Here's why I'm proud of you. Because, as Abraham Lincoln said, public sentiment is everything. With public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. Public sentiment is on our side, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for holding this hearing. I thank the champion, Chairman Thompson, and I want to thank Ms. Eastman for saying this is probably, no, you did say, not probably, you said this is the most important issue facing our generation. May this body hear you, pass this legislation, get it to the Senate, send it to the President, and begin to save lives. Ms. Lideker, we must show that we care. We must act as though we care. I am mystified that the folks, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, instead of approaching this hearing today by saying, you're right, we have a problem, what can we do about it? Instead, their step immediately out of the box was, this isn't a good move. You're not going to save any lives this way. Let me tell you how background checks save lives. And as I end it in my statement, I want to pivot to Ms. Thomas, to the Chief, and to the Major to talk about the efficacy of background checks. Let me tell you the numbers in my state, Pennsylvania. As we know, nearly 40,000 people were killed by gun violence in 2017. Over 1,600 took place in my state of Pennsylvania. 91 of those lives were lost in my single district. We in Pennsylvania have not only the NICS system, but we have a robust overlay, the Pennsylvania Instant Check System. And I will ask at the end of my time, Mr. Chairman, for unanimous consent to put in a report of the 2017 PICS annual report showing the efficacy of the PICS and NICS systems. Here's some of the numbers. Between its inception in 1998, and this is run by the Pennsylvania State Police, heroically, frankly, with such duty and care. Since its inception till 2017, PICS referred more than 26,000 investigations, were responsible for more than 7,000 arrests, almost 4,000 convictions as a result of prohibited purchasers attempting to purchase and failing background checks. And of those, PICS has been responsible for the apprehension of more than 2,200 individuals with active arrest warrants. So for those who would have you believe, oh, that the bad guys aren't ever going to try to go buy a gun, nonsense, utter nonsense. The good news about the PICS system also is it does not suffer the Charleston loophole. Instead of a default when we can't get an answer of yes or no, a default to, okay, yeah, we'll sell you the gun, as in Charleston. There's no default. The default is to no, and the purchaser must appeal and find clarity in that background check. And so having said those things, and just being so proud that this committee is going to do something about this, that this Congress is going to do something about this, and it's because of all of you, I wanted to ask you, please, can you comment also on the efficacy of robust and complete background check systems?
Time of the lady, the gentlelady has expired. The witness may answer the question.
I would simply say that in states where we have robust regulation, states like Pennsylvania that have moved to fill some of the loopholes in federal law, states like California, Connecticut, New York, we are seeing a far greater reduction in gun violence and gun injuries. When you look at states with strong laws, you see much lower gun death rates. States with weak laws have much higher gun death rates. So we know that when states like Pennsylvania and others take action to fill those loopholes, gun violence and gun death in that state is reduced. It's not enough. We need a federal system that doesn't create a patchwork of laws. Something like H.R. 8 actually fills the gaps that lead to trafficking. The iron pipeline was mentioned before, up to states with stronger gun laws. So we do need that federal law. But in the meantime, without it, states are taking action and they're seeing positive results from it.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record the Pennsylvania Institute Check System report.
Without objection, the report will be entered into the record.
Thank you.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. Ms. McCarcel-Powell of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you especially for holding such a critical hearing. I think it's been long overdue, the first hearing discussing the effects of gun violence in over a decade. Thank you to all the witnesses for being here with us this afternoon. As some of you may already know, the issue of gun violence is deeply personal to me. And unfortunately, it's very personal for too many Americans now. Gun violence is the leading cause of death in American children. And I want all of us to think about that just for one moment. Far more children die in this country because of a bullet than because of cancer. My father was a victim of gun violence. When I was 24 years old, I received a phone call. I was getting my master's degree to be told that my father had been shot and killed by a criminal with a gun. The pain that I feel when we discuss this issue here today, when I hear the news of the mass shootings in Parkland, Orlando, Vegas, is there. My father never had the chance to walk me down the aisle. He never met my children. And I want all of you to know that when I took the oath of office, I made a promise that I would not stop until we finally passed common sense gun reform, because I owe it to my father, I owe it to my sisters, to so many parents that have lost their children in my community, and I owe it to all of you here today. Sometimes people say that this tragedy happened in Ecuador and that this is America, so why should that matter in the context of gun violence here in the United States? And I can tell you why. The trauma inflicted upon families is always the same, no matter where you are in the world. We are united not by the place where we were born, but by our own personal experiences. My family was devastated in Ecuador, and so too were many family members in my community. And I want to remind all of you and tell you a little bit about someone that lost his life in my community. Carnell Williams Thomas was only 2 years old when he was playing outside of his apartment complex building. He was shot and killed by a stray bullet. I met his parents, who every day mourn the loss of their toddler, the mother knowing that every year that passes, she'll never be able to see him going through elementary school, graduating from middle school, high school. There are so many steps that we can take to address the source of gun violence across this country. Universal background checks will not prevent all deaths, but they are a very important first step. And I know that somehow it's changing, because when I see all of you here today, I know that finally we're going to be able to pass common sense gun reforms. I wanted to also just briefly answer to some of the comments that I've heard here today that are extremely offensive and insulting. I know that some people believe that the criminals that are killing and committing all these murders are immigrants. I am an immigrant, and the research is clear that immigrants are significantly less likely to commit crimes than US-born citizens, whether documented or undocumented. And I also want to remind that we need to be respectful of those who have lost their lives to gun violence. We have 2 people in Parkland who were immigrants, Martin Duque Anguiano and Joaquin Oliver. With that, I would like to ask Ms. Thomas, if you could just elaborate on, I know that you've done research on this topic, on the increase of mass shootings with assault weapons after the ban was lifted. If you can just talk to me a little bit about that research.
I'll just very briefly say that if you look at high fatality mass shootings, which are mass shootings of 6 people or more, in the years after the expiration of the assault weapon ban in 2004, high fatality mass shooting injuries went up by more than 200%. If you look at high fatality mass shootings during the time of the ban, those were down by almost 40%. So while it's difficult to measure the impact on a one-by-one basis, if you look at those mass shootings that really are the most impactful, there is a significant difference during the ban and since the ban took effect. And those numbers have continued to rise year after year after year. So we're seeing more and more of these types of shootings as these types of very lethal weapons proliferate more.
And
Time of the general lady has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Does the gentleman have a unanimous consent request?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I ask that this UC Davis health study entitled "Study Does Not Find Population Level Changes in Firearm Homicide or Suicide Rates in California, 10 years after comprehensive background check and violent misdemeanor policies enacted," be admitted without...
Without objection, the document will be admitted into the record. Mr. Liu of California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. According to the Center for Disease Control's latest figures, 109 people die from gun violence every day. That comes out to 9 people every 2 hours. So since this hearing has started, over 23 people in America have been shot and killed by guns. And no community is immune from gun violence. In my hometown of Torrance, 1 month ago, 3 people were killed at a bowling alley. In 2017, in Las Vegas, that mass shooting, a number of my constituents were killed. It does not have to be this way. And all of us are entitled to our opinions. I thank many of you here in this room for your advocacy and for the witnesses for being here. But when we legislate, we should do it on facts. So I'm just going to talk about some studies and then put them into the record. In 2018, researchers at Johns Hopkins University and UC Davis published a study called Association Between Firearm Laws and Homicide in Urban Counties, where they found that right to carry and stand your ground laws are associated with increases in firearm homicide, while permit to purchase laws and those prohibiting individuals convicted of violent misdemeanors have been associated with decreases in firearm homicide. Second study, in 2014, researchers at Johns Hopkins University published Effects of the Repeal of Missouri's Handgun Purchaser Licensing Law on Homicides. They found that the repeal of Missouri's permit to purchase law was associated with a 25% increase in firearm homicides. In 2018, researchers at New York Presbyterian Weill Cornell Medical Center published a study where they found that strong state firearm policies were associated with lower homicide rates, and strong interstate policies were also associated with lower homicide rates. They also found that strong firearm policies were associated with lower suicide rates as well. And then in 2017, researchers at Duke University did a study where they analyzed Connecticut's extreme risk law and found that for every 10 to 20 risk warrants issued, 1 suicide was prevented. And I would like to enter these into the record with unanimous consent.
Without objection, the documents will be entered into the record.
I do note that some of these studies do mention suicide. And if you look at the overwhelming number of gun deaths, they occur because of suicide. 3 in 5 gun deaths are a result of suicide. And my first question is to Dr. Saccharin. Wanted to see if you had any ideas or solutions how we could better address the number of people being killed by suicide by gun.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. When you look at suicides, and it's important when we're looking at deaths in general to really break up these different populations, because actually suicide deaths are primarily in older white male. And in this population, specifically, there is an association from a mental health perspective. So, some of the stuff that we're hearing about access to mental health is absolutely correct and it's true. But the way we have to approach this and think about this is from a systems perspective. And we can't just have one necessary solution. So another aspect is the extreme risk protection order policies that we've been talking about. enabling families and law enforcement to actually be proactive in preventing these from happening.
Thank you. Ms. Thomas, do you think extreme risk laws would help prevent suicides?
Absolutely. You know, extreme risk protective orders are intended to be used by law enforcement and family members, and very often family members have warning signs and indicators that a loved one is showing signs of distress or crisis, and they know often when their loved ones have guns. So being able to utilize that process to protect their loved ones from causing harm to themselves is an incredibly valuable tool for preventing suicides, along with things like safe storage laws.
Thank you. And let me conclude by noting that earlier in testimony, one of the Republican witnesses, Professor Malcolm, had stated that had shooter Cruz in Parkland been put on a background list, he would not have passed a background check and would not have gotten a gun. So I'm pleased you acknowledge that the background system could have prevented him from getting a gun. I know that it wasn't quite accurate because Cruz could have walked into a gun show and gotten a gun. That's what H.R. 8 will do. It will prevent people from doing that. So I look forward to your support of H.R. 8. And with that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman, and Ms. Demings of Florida is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and to all of our witnesses. Thank you so much for being here with us. I know it's been a long, long day. To the advocates and survivors and supporters in the audience too, we appreciate you, and we appreciate you being here to hold us accountable. This is a tough subject, I think, for everybody, well, most people in the room. I spent 27 years as a law enforcement officer, and I served as the chief of police in Orlando. And I gotta tell you, I'm sick and tired of watching sons and daughters and husbands and wives and mothers and fathers die through gun violence by someone with a gun who should have never had a gun in their possession in the first place. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle can't tell me a dang on thing about rights. Because you know what? I can't help but think about the rights of the victims who died at the hands of someone with a gun who should have never had a gun in the first place. My goodness, in a country that we say is the greatest country in the world, we are 25 times more likely to be killed through gun violence. In a country that we say is the greatest country in the world, my God, you ought to be able to go to school, go to church, go to synagogue, go to a concert, go to a movie theater, go to a nightclub, not just in Orlando, but in any city in this country, and not have to worry about somebody walking in with a gun. Ronald Reagan, Republican president, said legislation would be worth passing if it meant even small reductions in gun violence. Which life? Tell me which life. If it saves one life, which life is not worth saving? Which life? And so I'm sick and tired of sitting here. I thank God that we're at least having a hearing, because we haven't had one in 8 years, and there's been a lot of talk about national emergencies and crises and you know, national health emergencies. Well, doggone it, when mass numbers of people die in this country, I would consider that, dang on it, and a national emergency. It's time. And Congress, we sit here with the ability and the power to do something. And history will not be kind to us if we continue to allow the gun lobby to buy us and sell us. Now is the time for change. If you don't have the guts or the courage
to do something about this issue and send a message to the American people who desperately turn to us, then it's time for you to leave. It's really time for you to leave. And I want to talk to my law enforcement colleagues, I still consider you colleagues, and to the emergency room doctor. You deal with this every day. You've not only had to break bad news to families whose loved ones weren't out doing the wrong thing, they were in the right place, a place they had the right to be, doing the right thing. Not only have you had to break that bad news, but you've also had to bury your own because they died as the result of someone who shouldn't have had a gun in the first place. I talked to an emergency room doctor after Pulse who shared to me the difference in the victims who were shot with an assault rifle versus those with a handgun. Chances of survival are almost zero when you're shot with an assault rifle. So please, in the little time we have left, Major in Chief, if you would please just talk about gun violence in your community and why this issue is so important to you, and then we'll end with the doctor.
Thank you for that, those comments. They're just really well taken. But I just want to just say real quickly, it is a scourge. It is ongoing. It is daily. And in our city, one of the problems we're having now is the Department of Justice legal team decided that fugitives can't be in the system. So we have 500,000 people that we know are wanted for a serious crime that would make them prohibited purchasers. And let me give you the example of that, how that can get women and children killed. My people go to a house, they find a woman that's been abused, the perpetrator of the crime's not there, we go out, we get a warrant, and if we can't enter that person into the system, that individual can go out, buy a firearm, come back and finish the job. And so there are a lot of loopholes that you're addressing. I just want to tell you all, thank you for your courage and thank you for speaking out. And again, I love prayers, I welcome prayers, but like I've said before, the American people, my mayor has me in my job to fight crime, and I think the American people have elected you not to just pray, but to actually lead and pass legislation that will save lives.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am, thank you. I just wanted to mention real quick, I have 13 deputies in my unit, and in 2015, they recovered 65 guns, 2016, 67 guns, 2017, 51 guns, 2018, 81 guns. So I find that these numbers continue to increase, and I just try to keep them encouraged. 13 people serving protective orders.
Thank you.
Thank you. This concludes today's hearing. I want to thank our distinguished witnesses for attending. I want to thank the members of the audience for the most part, observing the decorum of the committee on a very emotional issue. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. With that, the hearing is adjourned.
Tomorrow on